I'm Susan Zesch. I'm a senior lecturer in the college here and executive director of the Human Rights Program. I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's program and have just a few preliminary remarks to make. First, I want to thank Sarah Patton Moberg for her marvelous logistics and organization of this event and all the others she's done for the last 6 years. We're going to lose Sarah this summer to University of Illinois at Chicago, where she's going to begin studying for a PhD. But all of you who have been on our list for many years know what terrific programs she puts together, and this is yet another one of them. Before I introduce the introducer, I want to just mention a couple of other events. Tomorrow, on Thursday of this week, the Heartland Alliance Marjorie Kovler Center for Survivors of Torture, together with Human Rights Watch and Percolator Films, are presenting the film Beneath the Blindfold at Wellington Avenue Church at 7:30 p.m. And there's a yellow leaflet going around if people want more details, those of you who might not know where Wellington Church is. Also, in the not-so-distant future, on June 6th, the Human Rights Program is sponsoring our annual Robert Kirshner Memorial Lecture, which will feature this year Aryeh Nair, who was the former National Executive Director of the ACLU and followed that by being the founding executive director of Human Rights Watch and has recently retired as president emeritus of the of George Soros's Open Society Foundations. It's our 15th anniversary. Professor Dr. Nair's talk will be followed by what we always referred to as a lavish reception. The Kirshner family, who sponsored that series in memory of Dr. Robert Kirshner, know that for Bob Kirshner, human rights was important, but food was equally fundamental. So we welcome you to that for an evening of intellectual stimulation and good food.
On a Thursday movie, are there any kind of student discount tickets available?
It's $12 in advance, $15 at the event. That's what it says here. You can look online. There, it says on the leaflet where you can go to ask questions. Tonight, our honored Pozen Professor William Schulz will be introduced by Ben Lawrence, and then Ben will tell you about the rest of Professor Schultz's series. Ben Lawrence is Assistant Professor of Philosophy here at the University of Chicago. He's an essential part of the Human Rights Program. He teaches our Human Rights 1 course, Philosophy of Human Rights, and he's on the board of the program. And I'm very pleased that Ben is here to introduce Bill Schulz.
So it's my great pleasure on behalf of the Human Rights Program at the University of Chicago to introduce our current Pozen visiting professor in human rights, Dr. William Schulz. He has many amazing credentials, obviously the most important of which is that he has a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Chicago. But he also has a Doctor of Ministry degree from the Meadville Lombard Theological School here. And from 1994 to 2006, he served as the executive director of Amnesty International USA, the world's oldest and largest human rights organization. Dr. Schulz is currently the president and CEO of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. He's also an adjunct professor of public administration at the Wagner School of Public Service at NYU, an affiliated professor at Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago. He's the author or editor of several books, including In Our Best Interest, How Defending Human Rights Benefits Us All, Tainted Legacy, 9/11 and the Ruin of Human Rights, The Future of Human Rights, and the Phenomena of Torture. And this quarter, we're very lucky to have him visiting with us, where he is currently teaching a course to 24 lucky undergraduates entitled Organizing for Human Rights Change. And tonight, he will be providing the first of 3 public talks. He will be delivering a talk entitled, Is Human Dignity Inherent? What Torture Has Taught Me. And then on Monday, May 13th, from 12 to 1:20, there'll be a lunchtime conversation about current human rights challenges at the Community Lounge at 5710 South Woodlawn Avenue. And then on Tuesday, May 21st, at this time, he will deliver the final talk, What Human Rights Activists Can Learn from Other Social Movements. And you can find all of this information at the Human Rights website, humanrights.uchicago.edu. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Schulz.
Well, thank you, Professor Lawrence. Very nice introduction. And I say that having been reminded of an introduction that was delivered many years ago to President William Howard Taft, who, as you'll recall, was a very large man. And I'm reminded of this because I just heard on the news that Governor Christie underwent stomach reduction surgery in February. President Taft apparently was introduced at the Riverside Club in California by Chauncey Depew, who was a great industrial magnate of the era. And Chauncey Depew said of President Taft, "Ladies and gentlemen, the truth is that President Taft is pregnant." And apparently President Taft had a very good sense of humor because he got up and he said, "Yes, it's true, I am pregnant. And if it is a boy, we will name it after me. If it is a girl, we will name it after my wife, Helen. But if, as I suspect, it is nothing but a bag of wind, we will name it Chauncey Depew." So I'm grateful to Professor Lawrence for not requiring me to respond in kind this evening. It's appropriate that a professor of philosophy introduced me because I'm about to illustrate that knowing a little bit of philosophy is a very dangerous thing. As you heard, I did receive a master's, but only a master's in philosophy here at the university. So the University of Chicago has no responsibility in any meaningful sense for the errors I'm about to commit. Meaning, of course, in the way that G.E. Moore and A.J. Ayer meant it. Those were two linguistic philosophers whom I studied here for an entire year and not one word of whom I ever understood. I also want to express my great appreciation to Richard and Ann Pozen, who of course are the ones who have established this opportunity for a variety of figures in the human rights field to be here at the university, and of course to Susan, Professor Zesch, for her leadership of the human rights program here, as well as her warm collegiality and welcome to me. Well, having established my philosophical mala fides, I now plunge in to talk about torture. I want tonight to tell you some of the things that I learned in my 12 years at Amnesty International about torture, but I want to also talk about the implications of what I learned for that bedrock principle of all human rights work, the principle that human rights are derived from the fact that human beings are creatures of inherent worth and dignity. And I want to argue that inherency, the notion that some quality, in this case dignity, is an automatic birth-bred feature of human nature. I want to argue that inherency is a dangerous ground upon which to rest the struggle for human rights. I don't go as far as Schopenhauer, who contended that the expression dignity of man was pure humbug, what Schopenhauer called the shibboleth of all empty-headed moralists. But I will argue that how we get to human rights is not what we customarily assume. The assumption that human rights are derived from inherent human dignity was built right into the first whereas clause of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which asserted that the inherent dignity and inalienable rights of all members of the human family are the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And the Universal Declaration, in turn, reflected in good measure such seminal documents as the Declaration of Independence, with its familiar conviction that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Or the French Declaration on the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which declared that men are born free and equal in rights, and hence, by implication, inherently invested in something that we could call dignity. But the question I want to ask is, what if our proverbial visitor from outer space, or a small child, or a contrarian philosopher like Schopenhauer, or an evil person were to say to us, prove it, how do you know that human beings have inherent dignity or are born free and equal in rights? What would we say? Or what if a person of a certain political bent were to say, I believe human beings' inalienable rights include not life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but life, liberty, the ownership of property, and the lowest possible corporate tax rate? How would we respond to that challenge? Well, this leads us to the matter of torture. Because torturers, I presume it is safe to say, neither believe in the inherent dignity of their victims nor display it themselves. About a week after I began my work at Amnesty in 1994, I came across a report of how the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, those were the predecessors to the Taliban, how they got rid of their prisoners. They tied each live prisoner to a corpse and then left the pair out in the sun to rot. Clever, simple, low-tech, and utterly terrifying. Close to 2/3 of the world's countries practice torture. Of course, if I had cited that statistic to an ancient Greek philosopher, his response would have been utter astonishment. Why only 2/3? Why not every one? He would have said. For the ancient Greeks and the Romans who came after them, torture was not only acceptable, it was standard practice. But the Greeks were very discriminating about who could be tortured. It was, not surprisingly, only slaves, not free citizens, who could be subjected to the whip and the chain. But this was true not just because slaves were slaves. The reason slaves could be tortured was because slaves did not possess the faculty of reason, and hence they lacked the capacity to dissemble, to lie to you. And so if you wanted to know the truth about something, all you had to do was to torture a slave who, unlike a free citizen, wasn't smart enough to tell you a lie. Well, unfortunate as the ancient use of torture may have been, it at least had the merit of being employed for a rational purpose, that is, to establish truth, to resolve disputes. And the rational use of torture extended into medieval times. In the Middle Ages, both civil and religious courts believed that it was unethical to convict someone of a crime on somebody else's word alone, that the only valid evidence of thievery or heresy or murder was a confession. And of course, what more effective way to elicit a confession than the rack and the screw? Torture was such a reputable instrument of justice that it was not until 1754 when Prussia, now Germany, became, ironically enough in the light of subsequent history, the first country to abolish the use of torture altogether. For about 150 years, torture went out of vogue, at least as an official instrument of government policy. But in the 20th century, it began to raise its ugly head again, and this time there was an important difference. For whereas in ancient Greece and medieval Europe, torture had been used to determine truth or to convict someone of a crime, in the 20th century, torture became an instrument of pleasure and a means of intimidating political opponents, a way to inflict pain on a person for a political end or even for the sheer sadistic joy of it. The reason that Abu Ghraib struck Americans like a thunderbolt is not because prisoners were being tortured. After all, 63% of Americans say that torture is acceptable, at least occasionally. The reason Americans turned ashen at Abu Ghraib was because even the staunchest defender of torture, as a means of extracting information, for example, could not pretend that forcing naked prisoners to form a pyramid, or to masturbate for the cameras, or to be tethered to a leash like a dog, had any purpose other than sheer humiliation. The ancient Greeks would have been ashamed. Well, over my years at Amnesty, I was perpetually dumbstruck by the sheer creativity of modern torturers. Of course, beatings are the most commonplace form of the art, on the back, on the buttocks, most painfully on the feet, and electroshock, especially to the penis, the vagina, the eyelids, the earlobes, is quickly gaining popularity with ever more sophisticated electroshock equipment available now, even to the general American public. But these are for mere beginners. In King Leopold's Congo, Belgian labor bosses regularly cut off the right hands of boys who did not meet their quota for mining of diamonds, and then proudly displayed baskets of severed hands on their office desks. In Brazil, prisoners were stripped naked and locked in small, bare concrete cells with only one other occupant, a boa constrictor. In Central America, soldiers were notorious for ripping open the wombs of pregnant women, tossing the fetuses into the air, and catching them on their bayonets. In contrast, our American obsession with water torture, most recently in the form of waterboarding or simulated drowning, sounds almost pristine. During the U.S. occupation of the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century, our soldiers inserted bamboo tubes into victims' throats and poured in gallons of water, the filthier the better, an early form of waterboarding. But the Filipinos got their revenge. They buried captured American soldiers up to their heads in manure, poured molasses over their heads, and then dropped hundreds of fire ants into the molasses. Now, practices such as these have no rational purpose at all. They are designed solely to strip another of his or her humanity. If anything deserves to be called unadulterated evil, these do. But what does this mean for the notion that a torturer, too, is a person of inherent worth and dignity? A South African neuropsychologist has theorized that cruelty, especially in males, is grounded in an adaptive reaction from the Paleozoic era, when early humans were predators and had to hunt for their food, and that the appearance of pain and blood in the prey was a signal of triumph, so that gradually the evocation of such reactions, howls of pain, the appearance of blood in our fellow humans, became associated with personal and social power, with the success of the hunt. Well, that theory strikes me as plausible, but if it is true, it doesn't lend much credence to the notion of inherent dignity. As that great theologian Genghis Khan put it in the 13th century, the greatest pleasure is to vanquish your enemies, to chase them before you, to rob them of their wealth, to see their near and dear bathed in tears, to ride their horses, and to sleep on the bellies of their wives and daughters. Not a lot of dignity, I'd say, in those reactions. So, who are the torturers? Are they madmen, deviants, hardened criminals, sexual predators? Almost never. In fact, most police and military units weed out the psychological misfits from their midst because they know that such people have trouble following orders. The horrible truth is that the vast majority of torturers are average Joes, occasionally, but rarely, average Janes. And it's remarkably easy to turn Joe into what most of us would regard as a monster. You put him in a restricted environment like a police or a military training camp under the command of a vaunted authority figure. You subject him to intense stress. The Greek military police in the time of the Greek generals, for example, were renowned for their brutality, and they got that way because each of them was subjected during training to severe floggings. They were forced to eat grass and cigarettes. They were restricted in how frequently they could urinate or defecate. And then, having created an angry, bitter, but obedient servant, you provide the sanction, the means, the opportunity, and the rationale for that servant to take his outrage out on a vulnerable but much despised population. These are the people who are threatening our country. These are the people who are killing your comrades. Who is this creature of inherent dignity who is so easily led astray? When I was 7 or 8 years old, I lived across the street from a little dog named Amy. And every afternoon after school, Amy and I would play together for an hour. One of Amy's favorite games was a dancing game in which I held her 2 forepaws in my hands and we would dance around the yard. Sometimes Amy even put her paws in my lap to signal that she wanted to dance. But I noticed that after a few minutes, Amy's hind legs would become sore and she would pull her paws away. The first few times that we played our dancing game, I dropped her paws the moment I sensed her discomfort, and we went on to something else. But one day I decided to hold on. The more Amy tugged, the tighter I held her paws, until finally she yelped in agony, and I let her go. But the next day, I repeated my demonic game. It was fascinating to feel this little creature, so much less powerful than me, entirely at my mercy. I was lucky that Amy was such a gentle dog because she had every right to have bitten me. And when, after 2 or 3 days, I saw that my friend, who had previously scrambled eagerly toward me when she saw me coming, now cowered at my approach. When I saw that, I realized with a start what I had done, and I was deeply frightened of myself and much ashamed. What had come over me that I would treat someone I had loved in that way? Well, after 4 years of psychotherapy here in Chicago, I now know, I learned many years ago that I was displacing my anger onto someone who had no threat to me. Bullies at school might pick on me. My 2 parents might tell their only child what he could and could not do. My piano teacher might try to slam the keyboard over my fingers when I played off key. But in that yard, I ruled supreme. Not only did I hold the power, but the one who was powerless for a change was not me. Now, the fact that a torturer or a little boy tormenting a dog appears not to display inherent dignity or to respect that quality in others, that's no more than circumstantial evidence of its absence. Other human beings we know all too well have acted with enormous kindness and dignity throughout the ages. But in the face of overwhelming evidence that displaying dignity and acting as if others possess it is at best an occasional and wholly unreliable event, what grounds do we have for maintaining that dignity is inherent and is therefore an adequate philosophical undergirding for human rights? Well, we have a couple of options. The first, of course, is God. From the standpoint of us active in the human rights movement, it would be wonderful if we could prove to the satisfaction of the world that some universally recognized deity had imbued human beings with inherent dignity and with a set of rights that happened to coincide exactly with the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, such that even the most enthusiastic atheist would prostrate herself before that tablet. But alas, given the enormous diversity of the world's faiths, even within the Christian church, I learned over here at Swift Hall 40 years ago, there were multiple heresies, including a group called Montanists, a group of early Christians called Montanists, who preached that only those who ate a steady diet of radishes would ever be saved. Given all this, it's a reasonable bet that we will not reach consensus upon a religious base for inherent dignity and human rights anytime soon. Well, the second major option is natural law. Typically, theologians have tried to rescue humanity from its own degradation by asserting that freedom was what underpinned our inherent worth. Freedom, the capacity that I retain to decide to stop hurting Amy the dog. The fact that not every student of torture chooses to finish the course. Philosophers, on the other hand, have more frequently cited reason as that quality that underlies inherent human dignity and distinguishes us from brute animals. But apart from arcane philosophical debates about free will, or more contemporary insights into the traits of animals, I wonder whether freedom and reason are robust enough characteristics of human beings sufficient to overcome the basest of brutality, or whether they reflect some long outdated hierarchical assumption that because human beings represent the pinnacle of evolutionary complexity, we somehow inherently possess some kind of merit. The objections to natural law as a basis for rights are long-standing. How do we know, for example, that freedom and reason, or any other trait for that matter, constitute the essence of being human? Isak Dinesen, the novelist, said famously, "What is man but an elaborate machine for turning red wine into urine?" Well, as far as we know, that capacity is shared by every human being, but the suggestion that it is what is most important about the human creature is one that most sober people are likely to reject outright. The history of natural law theory would suggest that conceptions of human nature have varied wildly throughout the ages, and that the ones that have predominated at any one time have done so far more for political than for philosophical or scientific reasons. The great champion of natural law, John Locke, of course, reflecting the prejudices of his time, famously believed that rights derived from nature only inhered in the propertied classes, and that hence women and peasants could make no claim to them. Friedrich Nietzsche believed that a human being has dignity only insofar as he is a tool of the man of genius. Pope John Paul II believed that women's inherent nature included dignity, but that dignity did not allow women to appropriate to themselves male characteristics contrary to their feminine, quote, originality. And what do we do with the ancient Euro people of Peru who did not believe that they were human at all, and hence would a priori reject any notion of human nature? The first problem with a natural law theory of rights and inherent dignity is that what is natural, and hence right, ends up being largely in the eye of the beholder. So it is little wonder that natural law was long the favored justification of the elite classes for the denial of rights to the oppressed. But even if we were to agree on a common human trait sufficient to buttress the inherency of dignity, we are next met with the so-called naturalistic fallacy, or to put it more colloquially, the problem of so what? So what that reason is what makes humans distinct? How does that fact lead us to any conclusions about how human beings should treat one another? Indeed, if our capacity to reason is our preeminent quality, then maybe only reasoning, in contrast to feeling or appreciating or worshiping, maybe only reasoning can be defined as good. The fact that we may possess reason tells us nothing about how we should morally exercise it. Which brings us to a third problem with natural law, namely, how do we get from a very general statement about human nature, human beings are characterized by freedom or reason, how do we get from that to a detailed list of rights specific enough to guide us in our day-to-day lives? How does the general trait of utilizing reason or possessing freedom help us decide whether people have a right to a fair trial, or to claim a nationality, or to marry without limitation to race or gender? Couldn't a reasoning creature decide that it would be best not to recognize a right to a nationality, but only a right to claim world citizenship? So for these and other reasons, natural law fails as a basis for human rights. Which leads to a final option I will mention, that dignity is not inherent, but assigned. This has been called the consensualist option. You know, I have fought tirelessly against the death penalty for the past 40 years. I have visited death rows. I have spoken frequently with condemned prisoners. Some of them have acknowledged their crimes and altered their hearts. Others of them are truly innocent. Many of them are mentally ill, and some of them are vicious, dangerous killers. I oppose the death penalty not because I believe that every one of those lives carries inherent dignity and worth. In some cases, their death would be no loss to anyone at all. I oppose the death penalty because I can't be sure which of them falls into which category. Which are truly innocent, which are mentally ill, which are vicious, dangerous killers. And because the use of executions by the state diminishes my own dignity and that of every other citizen in whose name it is enforced. The death penalty has been declared by the international community to be the mark of a brutalizing society, and I don't want to live in such a place. I need, in other words, to assign the occupants of death row, to assign them worth and dignity in order to preserve my own. But I find no such characteristics inherent in either them or me. If a loved one of mine was murdered, I would want her murderer to suffer the worst torments of hell that I could imagine. No torture would be too great to satisfy my lust for revenge. But I do not want the state to indulge me in my worst impulses. Part of the role of government is to save us from our basest passions in order to extract some semblance of worth and dignity out of the muck and meanness that infects our hearts. So, is the worth and dignity of every person inherent? My quarrel is not with the concept of dignity, it is with the notion that it is inherent. Inherency is a political construct, perhaps a very useful political myth, but a myth nonetheless, designed to cover up the fact that we are all sinners and that we are not always certain which sins and hence which sinners are worse than others. Each of us has to be assigned worth. It does not come automatically. Each of us has to be taught to behave with dignity. Because as Sartre once observed somewhere, if it were not for the petty rules of bourgeois society, we humans would destroy each other in an instant. But who does the assigning of worth? How do we know that torture is wrong? What is the basis for human rights? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that human rights are whatever the international community, through its various declarations, covenants, treaties, conventions, say that they are. And that the reason torture is wrong is because a general consensus of global opinion, as expressed through those instruments, says that it's wrong. Was torture wrong even before anyone in the world, including the slaves being tortured, thought that it was wrong? Was it wrong? Even before they thought it was wrong? Before anyone thought it was wrong? Was it wrong? The hard answer is no. Or if it was wrong in some parallel ethical universe, it was certainly no violation of anybody's rights until a significant number of people in this world began to say that it was. When South Carolina shut down its video poker parlors a few years ago, one stalwart gambler was quoted as saying, "This is like the state telling me I have no rights. It's pretty close to being communist." I'm sorry, but there is as of yet no international consensus that all human beings have a right to play video poker. The obvious objection to this notion of human dignity needing to be assigned, not found inherent, and human rights needing to be defined by consensus is that it means that at least theoretically the world could regress and torture, for example, could once again be deemed acceptable. And that's theoretically true. But experience seems to show that the more people who are involved in decision-making about rights, including the victims of those violations, the less likely the backsliding. And what are the advantages to this approach? The neoconservative, or at least former neoconservative political philosopher Francis Fukuyama of end of history fame, has argued, quote, "What gives human beings dignity and a moral status higher than that of other living creatures?" Now think on that phrase a minute. A moral status higher than other living creatures cannot be reduced to the possession of moral choice or reason or language or sociability or emotions or any other quality that has been put forth as the ground of human dignity. It is all of these qualities together in a human whole. Okay, that's Fukuyama. And then he goes on to conclude from this assertion of inherent human dignity and superiority that this explains why there are a lot of capitalist liberal democracies around the world at the beginning of the 21st century, but very few socialist dictatorships. You see, Fukuyama has made exactly the assertion that I mentioned at the outset this evening, namely that his conviction, his conception of human dignity entails life, liberty, the ownership of private property, and the lowest possible corporate tax rate. People of widely disparate political views advocate natural law theory, but neoconservatives particularly love it because it is imprecise enough to allow them to pick and choose the rights they like and to discard the ones they find inconvenient. How interesting that though the biological needs for food and shelter are probably the common human traits least difficult to establish, neither Fukuyama nor any of his neoconservative counterparts would ever be caught dead arguing that social and economic rights are indisputable imperatives derived from human nature. It's not very likely that neoconservatives will ever conclude that the death penalty is a violation of nature's laws, or that gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people have a natural right to full expression of their sexuality. But in a consensualist approach to human rights, our rights are derived not through the exercise of narrow ideological bias, but through an open process of consensus building. This means that unless you can get a preponderance of the world's people, as reflected in international human rights instrumentalities, to agree with you, you cannot assert that some vague notion of inherent dignity mandates such things as the superiority of the white race, the inferiority of women, or any number of other morally bankrupt notions. It means that the answer to the question of why torture is wrong is because the world community, struggling as it does to describe the nature of a civilized society, says that it's wrong. It also non-incidentally means that the rights of animals may eventually come to be recognized as worth protecting, and that is something that no concept of human rights based upon inherent human dignity can ever justify. And finally, it means that the human rights movement, the movement that is primarily responsible for widening the circle of those who are assigned dignity and broadening the understanding of those things that are called rights, the human rights movement needs to be as sophisticated and effective a movement for social change as it can be. Because you see, if we can't rely upon the inherency of human worth, if we have to assign worth and teach dignity, then we cannot escape confrontation with the forces of idolatry who would reserve worth only to a few and save dignity solely for their like kind or their immediate neighbors. What human rights activists can learn about being an effective social movement, that will be the subject of my second lecture on May 21st. Well, I've spoken a lot this evening about all that torture taught me about our basest proclivities, but that was not all that I learned in my encounters with torturers. I also learned much about human nobility, enough to convince me, even in the face of our perversity, that we human beings deserve that designation, that assignment of dignified persons. And I want to close with 4 short vignettes which build upon each other. The first is from the memoir of a torturer, in which the stirrings of the spirit are just barely visible, but maybe they're working nonetheless. General Paul Osirisis was a French intelligence officer in occupied Algeria in the 1950s. He's still alive, and to this day, at age 95, he is one of the most outspoken defenders of the use of brutality in the cause of national security. His memoir, The Battle of the Kasbah, is full of callous disregard for his victims. But here is his fascinating description of a conversation he had with a physician over the dead body of a prisoner he had just tortured to death. "I was talking to the prisoner and he fell ill," I said unconvincingly. "He told me he had tuberculosis. Doctor, can you see what's wrong with him?" "You were talking to him?" the doctor asked incredulously. "You were talking to him? But he's drenched in blood. You must be kidding." "No, I wouldn't do such a thing," I said. "But he's dead," said the doctor. "It's possible," I said. "But when I called for you, he was alive." And then, since the doctor was still not cooperating, I lost my cool. And I said, "And so, you want me to say I killed him? Would that make you feel better? Do you think I enjoy this?" "No," said the doctor, "but then why did you come to get me when he was dead?" I didn't answer. The doctor finally understood. I had called him so that he would get the body out of my sight once and for all. You see, the angel occasionally finds even a torturer's ear. But more often, of course, it is the victims of torture and their families who teach us how to live. The great Soviet poet Anna Akhmatova spent 17 months waiting with others in the prison queues of Leningrad to see their loved ones who were being tortured inside. One day, somebody in the crowd recognized her. Standing behind me, the poet recalled later, standing behind me was a woman with lips blue with cold. "You're a poet, aren't you?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "I am." "Can you describe this?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "I can." Then something resembling a smile passed over what once had been that woman's face. Nick Yaris spent 23 years in prison for a murder that he did not commit. I assure you that is a singular form of torture. When he was released, I asked him how he felt. And this is what he said. "What are my choices? I could be really devastated and angry and let them continue to own me, or I could have fun. Having fun sounds better. The lowest insult would be if I came out destroyed, a broken man. My survival technique is to become a good man." Perez Aguirre was tortured mercilessly in a South American prison. And many years later, walking along the street, he ran into the man who had tortured him. The torturer was now among those who was being prosecuted, and he tried to avoid Aguirre's gaze. But Aguirre took the initiative. "How are you?" he asked his torturer. The man said he was very depressed. He was being prosecuted. There was a long pause, and then Aguirre said, "If you need anything, come to see me." And then he said, "Shake hands, friend. I forgive you." What torture has taught me, what all those brave souls, and yes, even a few of their tormentors have taught me, is to never give up on the glimmers of grace, for not everything is all that it seems. If even torturers and their survivors can reclaim a sense of life's bounty, then surely the rest of us can too. If a torturer cannot fully break the human spirit, nobody can. And if even those who endured the most extreme brutality retained their faith in human dignity, then assigning that to others and protecting it whenever it is under threat, that is surely the highest and the noblest calling in the world. Thank you.
I think Professor Schulz can take questions for a bit. We're also passing around a sign-up sheet, particularly for people who are not on the human rights list. I know I recognize a lot of faces here, people I know are on our mailing list, but if you want to get notices of future programs, please make sure that we have your name and email address. So questions? Comments?
How do you
If people can identify themselves.
Oh, I'm Bob Clark with the Illinois Coalition Against Torture. I'm wondering how you measure this preponderance of world consensus against a particular practice or assigning a certain minimal value to every human being. When do you determine that that line has been crossed and that this has been established and the world community agrees? By examining treaty language or?
Well, in the case of torture, we have a pretty simple way because we have an explicit treaty, the Convention Against Torture and Other Inhumane, Degrading Treatment, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. And we can measure it very simply by the number of countries that have ratified that treaty. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that all of those countries are abiding by the terms of that treaty. Absolutely not. But certainly it does say something about the establishment of norms. And as the number of countries that have ratified that treaty has grown, then at least theoretically the norm itself has been strengthened. There are plenty of other treaties that have virtually unanimous world support. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, for example, has been ratified by all countries except Somalia, which had no working government, and the United States. But every single other country has ratified. We just saw the Treaty on Small Arms, passed by every country except 3, I believe. Iran, South Korea, and somebody else. I mean, so these come pretty close to being a fair measurement of world standards, not world practices, but world standards. And what are norms except certain standards that are affirmed? Now, there are all sorts of other ways, from court decisions to public opinion, but that is the most formal way. Yes.
I guess I'm definitely not convinced by your proposal that human rights comes from assigned dignity, but rather it comes from inherent dignity. And just on the inherent dignity side, you cited sort of this pathological killers that exist, and they don't have inherent dignity. There's the others that are in prison may, but they do not. And I think what happens there is he does have, or she does have, inherent dignity, but that dignity has not been respected either by the killer or by his in himself or herself and those around them. So I guess I'm not yet convinced of that. I find it an interesting thought to think about, but my experience comes, I remember my first experience in human rights on the reason for human rights came from in El Salvador, from the Social Secretariat, again, a Christian organization, the Archdiocese, during the El Salvador War. And she said, why do we do human rights? Because every human being is created in the image of God. That's where their starting point was. And, while I don't necessarily believe that religion assigns those or sets the level for inherent dignity of, I think it's a recognition from different places that, yes, in the end, it's the inherent dignity of each human being that prompts the work on human rights. Nor do I believe, I don't believe you haven't convinced me either that human rights based on inherent human dignity means that humans are superior in the realm of nature. It's a human rights based on dignity, inherent dignity, is relational. It's relational to one another, and it's relational also to our world. And I think what has happened, just because torture was used in the Spanish Inquisition and there wasn't enough consensus at that point that torture was wrong, doesn't mean that it wasn't torture. And that the victims of torture, both who went through it and their families, weren't wronged. And finally, just the whole question of where it leads in terms of impunity. By not recognizing the torture for what it is and the harm, the physical and mental harm that it does to human beings, leads to acceptance of that and leads to impunity by not being prosecuted. So anyway, those are some just initial responses to...
Let me be very...
Gary, can you introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Gary Cosette. I'm Program Director for Chicago Religious Leadership Network on Latin America.
So let me say that I am not interested in convincing you. All I'm interested in is, I have absolutely no interest in convincing you or anyone else of my position on this. I have worked my entire career with people who don't agree with me on this issue and who find the basis of human dignity in some source that I don't believe is satisfactory, at least as far as I'm concerned. And my only question to you would be, if you don't agree with this, then what do you believe? What would you say to that Martian or to Francis Fukuyama? I gather from your remarks that you would say that it is because a human being is made in the likeness of God or something like that. That's absolutely fine. If you would like to say that and you believe that, I respect your faith, I respect your position on this. I just ask you to recognize that that is not a position that is going to gain universal or even anything like it consensus, given the complicated nature of our of religious faith and the fact that in many parts of the world there is no sense at all that human beings are made in the likeness of God. There isn't even a sense of the kind of God you're talking about in whose likeness they could be made. So I'm only asking that you and others recognize the potential flaws in that perspective. I'm happy to work with you. Your last comment is not relevant to what I said. There is nothing that I have said or that the consensualist argument in any way implies that torture is not horrendous. And if I didn't convey at least to you my recognition of that, I certainly regret that because I've spent my entire career the last 20 years fighting torture. So that is not the point at all. And I respect your point of view. I don't agree with it. You don't agree with me. We'll work together against torture. I only want you to recognize the extent to which your position can be exploited by some of those with whom I think neither you nor I would ever agree. Who else?
Sure, I want to ask one question about the consensus view, which is, so I have a worry that, so take American chattel slavery. So let's just go back to a time before there was a consensus on its injustice. Now, of course, there were lots of people who thought it was unjust. Slaves, for example.
Maybe not.
Maybe not all of them.
There was some point at which probably none of them did.
Well, I don't know about that.
But I don't think you or I can know the answer to that. But go ahead.
Perhaps, but that's not my point is, it seems like on this theory, you're forced to say that at that time, there was nothing wrong with slavery. And if that was what you thought about that, then I have trouble understanding why you would ever think anyone would have any reason to try to move the society towards a condition where there would be consensus that it was wrong. If it's not broken, don't fix it. What's the, you know what I'm saying?
So my point is that there was no human right at that point. That is what I'm talking about. Now you've transposed that into a question of right and wrong. But I'm trying to talk about the basis of human rights. And let me give you an example from maybe 50 to 100 years in the future. I gave this in class the other day, so it's familiar to me. I suspect that there is no one in this room who believes that it is a violation of any ethical standard for us to cut flowers and to display them as an expression of beauty. I suspect that there is no one in the world, or at least of our acquaintance, who today regards that as some kind of a morally corrupt act. But I would not be entirely surprised if 50 years from now or 100 years from now, with greater knowledge about the way in which plants react to harm and so on, that the consensus about that were to shift. And maybe you can find other examples, but we certainly know that even we can take the example of LGBT rights today. Eleanor Roosevelt, who I think we have very good reason to believe may have been lesbian or at least bisexual herself, couldn't even conceive that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that she helped author had anything to do about LGBT rights. And yet today, we certainly do interpret portions of it and other covenants as respecting, defending human rights for LGBT persons. So what I'm saying is that we may today, I don't think any of us today would say that cutting flowers is a violation of the rights of plants. But it is certainly conceivable that at some point in the future we would believe that. And I'm asking you, does that mean that today, because of our ignorance or our lack of full appreciation for plants, we are somehow wrong? No. I think it means that plants don't have that level of rights at this point in our society, just as LGBT people didn't 50 or 60 years ago, and that is an evolving process. I'm happy to have you come back at me, but that's how I would respond.
No, it was helpful you're distinguishing human rights from, so I mean, you might be willing to say it was wrong. It was, even if there was a consensus, it might still be morally wrong, even if there's not yet a human.
Well, I certainly think we today would call it morally wrong. There's no question about that. Whether or not people living in that era would call it morally wrong, I think is highly dubious, but that's true of any number of things.
I'm Mario Venegas, member from HITECH and Amnesty International, for over 50 years. Among other organizations working here in the Chicago area. I'm a survivor of torture from the Pinochet era in Chile.
Right.
And you have mentioned at the very last part of your talk, when a survivor of torture was confronting the torturer, and at the very end he's forgiven, or she's forgiven. And I tell you that I have suffered the experience of going in court in Chile, where they've been trying torturers and have to confront the two torturers that torture me, which, by the way, were trained in School of the Americas here in the United States.
Yeah.
And it's so difficult, the word forgive.
I'm sure.
It's so difficult to forgive when the torturers will never admit that they did it, when they will never say, I'm sorry what I did. And this is even part of what the discussion in Chile today, and I know in many other countries around the world, in terms of, for instance, the relative of the people that disappear, they had a law that say, there's no forgiveness, no forgive. I mean, we're not going to forget, we're not going to forgive. Until the society, the social fabric has been affected by this, because the person that's tortured is not the one that's only suffered. And when we are talking about dignity and the death penalty, I would say dignity also with the society, with the individual, the family, the neighborhood, everyone has been affected because of the dignity of torture. And when there's no social justice, when there's no impunity, when there is impunity, and where indefinitely there's no accountability for the people that have committed this crime, how can you say, I forgive?
Yeah. Well, I understand exactly what you're saying, Mario. This is a story from James Wexler's book. This is not a personal experience of mine, but let's remember something. In this case, the person was being prosecuted. In the case that we're talking about, I think your point is very well made, that in the absence of any kind of accountability, or in this case, prosecution, it is not only very difficult to forgive, but it is probably very unwise, because it exonerates people without any degree of accountability. So I think that what's important to remember about that story from Wexler is that this was in the middle of prosecutions, because I think your point is very well taken.
Some argue that torture should be banned, but there should be an exception And the example that they give is if there's an imminent terrorist attack
Sure.
and a suspected terrorist is apprehended,
Sure.
that they might be able to give information that would prevent the horrible attack. What do you think is the best way to respond to them? The only argument that I seem to hear is that, well, those who argue, well, torture doesn't work, so that's why you don't do it. Is there a better way to argue that?
Well, the first thing to say is that in a pure situation such as you've described, it is very hard unless you take what's called a deontological position, which is a position that is just flat opposed on moral grounds to torture. It's certainly very hard on any utilitarian grounds to argue that, except for the following. It is inevitably the case that the torture of a victim will result in enormous resentment on the part of that victim's cohort or community. And that may well, even on utilitarian grounds, mean that there will be thousands and thousands who are killed, and even a strict utilitarian calculation may not be accurate. But the other response to this is that, sure, in a pure situation, we've got 5 minutes, we've got to convince this guy to give up information, and then we're going to... The reality is, and I've studied this for a long time, I have never found a situation that conforms to that theoretical abstract. Never. The torture that takes place has often taken place over long periods of time. Even those few instances in which the U.S. government claims that they have obtained torture, it has not been ticking bomb syndrome where they had to obtain the information in 10 minutes to save thousands of lives. That's not what happens. The torture takes place over a long period of time. And that means that there is absolutely no reason to believe that another approach, that other forms of interrogation, which are often far more effective, could not be utilized. So I think there are, outside of a very pure case, there are significant ways to be able to refute this. But, you know, I'm quite interesting. At the end of the day, I would say this to a government that has to make this decision. All right, let's agree that torture is wrong under all circumstances. But if you, in a position of authority, believe that you need to torture in order to obtain information, then we will do it this way. You go ahead and you will then, after the fact, stand trial, and you will have to defend and prove the fact that your actions actually saved lives. I think it will be very difficult for that ever to obtain. Yes, sir. In the back.
I'm Randy from Revolution Books. I just wanted to announce that there's a protest against the Guantanamo torture here in Chicago at Federal Plaza Friday, May 17th from 4 to 6. And that's World Can't Wait and all kinds of groups all over the world. You know, groups out of England in particular are sponsoring similar protests all over the world from, I guess, the 17th to the 19th of this month. And I did want to respond briefly, you know, in other words, I hear a lot of moral relativism, you know, and I understand that that's almost universal in academia, you know, but there is an argument for moral certainty. You know, the torture is just wrong in every circumstance. I feel that you can actually give a scientific underpinning to that, you know, in terms of like, what are humanity's fundamental interests in getting beyond exploitation and oppression, and even beyond rights, you know, where you don't have class-divided society, you know, and if you want to see a concrete example of that, there's a Constitution for a New Socialist Republic, outlaws torture, outlaws the death penalty. And if you want to see how you could actually have a real different world based on science, but where there is a moral dimension that is not one-to-one with that, but based on that. And you can have a moral certainty.
Well, all right. All I can say is this. Of course, I'd be delighted to learn of the scientific basis that doesn't violate the naturalistic fallacy, but I will say this. Here's my problem. I think that to just make a blanket assertion that torture is wrong puts human rights advocates in a one-down position in relation to people like Dick Cheney. And it is quite clear that there are people in this country who have been in positions of significant leadership, who may well still be, at least in the Congress, in positions of significant leadership, who, unless they are provided with some more nuanced argument against torture, are just not going to accept you or me making a blanket statement that torture is wrong without any further conversation. That's my problem with your position. I'd love it if that would happen. I'd love it if the whole world would accept everything I said as certain and true just because I said it. I mean, who wouldn't like that kind of? We all would like that kind of world. But we don't live in that kind of world. And that's why I think we have to be more sophisticated, more nuanced about these issues.
Well, I've been a graduate student in philosophy longer than you were.
Congratulations.
And yet, I don't make these remarks in the spirit that I, have very much to teach you. I feel that you've had, whatever your concerns about inherent human dignity as a basis for human rights, it hasn't stopped you from, having a life where you're pursuing the human rights agenda
Of course not.
all the time. So I wonder if there might be something else going on that might explain why not everybody just says, okay, he's right, he's figured it out, he knows about good and evil, and he's been in the middle of this for all this time. I feel that if you say, okay, it's not inherent, but we can assign it to people, and then if you were to go ahead and assign it to everybody, then there wouldn't be much difference functionally, between the view of inherent human dignity and the view that we are capable of assigning it, except that maybe you might not want to assign it to everybody. I believe that you would want to assign it very broadly. For example, the bombers in Boston, I suspect that you and I and most of the people in the room would say that it's important that the bomber that's dead should be able to get buried because of some assigned dignity, if not inherent dignity, that the bomber that survived should get a fair trial, etc., because this is the society that we want to live in, not necessarily the society that they were trying to create. And so I think that dignity is such a funny word because I think it's an older concept of dignity, that it can be gained or lost. I think the first concept of dignity was conditional. And, if you were brave, then you had dignity. And if you were cowardly, you were considered to have lost your dignity and you were shamed.
Well, honor, I think, is what.
Yeah, it's closely
more
tied with that.
Yes.
Now, the kind of dignity that people talk about when they use the word inherent, which may or may not be the right word to use, it's a dignity that cannot be lost or gained by anything that you do. So if you go out and bomb people indiscriminately in Boston, there is some concept of dignity that you don't lose or gain even by doing this horrendously evil thing. And it's that concept of dignity that we appeal to when we say that that person should have a burial just like anybody else.
But we can say exactly the same thing in consensualism. It's called non-derogable rights. There are derogable rights and there are non-derogable rights. And non-derogable rights are ones that, you're absolutely right, cannot be violated no matter what you do. But that can be established equally as well on a consensualist basis. My only point here, I don't expect actually any of you to agree with me. But I think I'm just trying to point out how frequently natural law has been used and inherency has been used in a way that I think all of us would find abhorrent, and how easy it is to do that. It is much harder to do that when you base rights on consensualism. Now, rights can regress under a consensualist notion, but it's much harder to do that if we say, this is the international community's description of non-derogable rights, of rights that must be assigned to every single person.
Okay. I simply would say that the consensus that we need is going to have to include you, people who believe in inherent human dignity. Johannes Morsink, a noted scholar of the Universal Declaration, wrote a book called Inherent Human Rights. He should be able to be in this consensus too. That's not the issue that I don't think ultimately divides us.
Well, that's fine.
We can take one more question. Well, two. We have two. We haven't any women speaking, so we've got two women.
Sure, please.
Why don't we get both questions out
Sure,
and then
sure.
Bill can fashion something?
Oh, I'll forget them. Let's just do
okay,
one
one
at a
at a
time.
time.
My question is a little more general in terms of the discourse of human rights, because I'm working very closely part of it. Although I'm a survivor of torture from Turkey, the 80s, the military there. This discourse, whether the human dignity is assigned or is part of a natural right, seems to lack a major component. And as far as I can see, if I'm mistaken, I would like you to please correct me. Based on two comments you have given to the questions, I was tempted to ask this question. When the the practice of torture does deprive the tortured ones of their dignity, or attempts to,
Absolutely.
as far as you know,
Yes.
depends on how you can resist it.
No,
or not.
absolutely.
But a component that is missing from the discourse is that the torturers are the first ones to lose their own human dignity.
Absolutely.
And are actually part of the victims of this
Absolutely.
process.
Absolutely.
So I have a feeling that the discourse lacks a major component which could provide a very convincing argument even to people like Cheney, because we are not only destroying our political opponents, but also our major servants.
Well, I don't know if you'd convince Cheney, but there's absolutely no doubt that what you have said is completely true. Frantz Fanon wrote about this. I write about this in my book, The Phenomenon of Torture. You're absolutely right. So I thank you for that comment. I didn't emphasize that overly much in my remarks, and it's appropriate for you to add that because it's completely true. Yes?
I kind of want to circle back to what he was saying
Sure.
earlier about
He's the professor.
Mr. Professor, I don't remember.
Lawrence.
And here at the UFC, we want our students to question the faculty.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. Well, no, she's questioning me, I'm sure.
I'm questioning you because
You're
what
right.
I didn't feel that was addressed very well was how, I mean, what he brings up here, what Professor Lawrence brings up is that, if it's assigned and there is no, I mean, if right and wrong or more aren't, okay. Basically, why is there change? Why should there be change? Why do people change? And why should you work to change consensus if it's not, if the majority believes it's just fine and you believe, no, it's wrong, under what authority do you become an activist to change public consensus?
Well, let me ask you this. Do you believe that the reason that we are seeing such significant change in attitudes toward marriage equality and LGBT rights is because a vast majority of Americans have suddenly said to themselves, oh my God, Kant's theory is right. I've been wrong all these years. That isn't how change takes place. The reason there are a whole congruence of factors that always go into making change. In this case, it has to do with social media, with a greater exposure to people who are owning that they are LGBT persons, with social experience, then providing, at least in a general sense, all that goes into that. And I think that's the way change always takes place. I think it always takes place that way.
The justification for pushing for change.
The justification for pushing for change is that we know that we define a civilized society as one in which more and more people are able to claim sets of rights. That is part of what a growingly civilized society is all about.
And what do you base that on?
What do you have to base it on? You base upon all sorts of things. You base it upon human experience. You base it upon experimentation with what works best in a society. You base it upon public opinion and its change. You base it upon notions of liberation. You base it upon
All of those seem to be
They-
subject to the naturalistic fallacy you talked about.
they are not subject to the naturalistic fallacy. They're certainly subject to potential regression. After all, we know that the ancient Greeks found homosexual relationships completely fine expressions of love, and then there was a long period of regression, I would say, about that, and now that is, we're emerging out of that period. You're right. I mean, it's not comfortable. I'm not suggesting that what I'm saying is comfortable. I just think it's true. I think it's the way social change takes place. It would be wonderful if we were able to have one theory that we all agreed upon, and that we then defined new sets of rights based upon that one theory, and that's what natural law has tried to provide us. It would be wonderful if that were true, or if God were the source of that. I'm afraid I believe the hard truth is that it isn't that way, because I have not heard a convincing argument, and therefore what I'm seeking is some alternative, which, look, I mean, the philosophy that I'm articulating actually is based upon Deweyan instrumentalism and William James's pragmatism and Peirce, and Richard Rorty. I mean, this is not Bill Schulz. This is not some newfound notion. It may be wrong, but it does have a distinguished philosophical heritage behind it. And I suspect that when Dewey gave his lectures here, people asked exactly the same questions of him about his instrumentalism. Okay.